The American Revolution, in other words, is never finished. It must always be renewed.
Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend.
What if it's not envy?
We must take back our cities, and take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
Well, Ernst, welcome to Contramundum, and thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you very much for the platform. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I mean, the challenge is always there, fitting in the whole South African picture into one conversation, but I'll try my best.
Yeah, let's just start this off by getting a little bit of your personal background. I mean, obviously, you are South African, so maybe tell us a little bit about your childhood and what formed your own mind and your approach to what's going on over there.
Right. So it's not too dramatic or epic of a story. I grew up in Malmesbury, which is a small town in the Western Cape province of South Africa, in the countryside, wheat and wine country. And yeah, I grew up there my entire life in a small town, and then I went off to study at Stellenbosch University. And after my studies, I directly started working for the organization called AfriForum, that we can get into a little bit more in regards to what we do as an organization. But I mean, that's genuinely what some of the most formative influences on my thinking has been, I think at least, has been where I grew up and who I was surrounded by. I was raised by two very principled parents in a very tight-knit community in the South African countryside, with a strong sense of identity and also a strong sense of you belong here at the southern tip of Africa. I mean, my father particularly has a encyclopedic knowledge of where our family comes from, but that's not unique to our family. A lot of Afrikaners, I think, particularly have a strong sense for genealogy. So I know exactly where my first ancestor that came to South Africa came from. I know in which street he lived in Amsterdam. I know in which church he got married. And yeah, when it comes to particularly my family, our first ancestor came here in 1688, before America was a country, and I'm the 9th generation since.
All right, well, let's do this then. So for people that have no idea what's going on, they have no idea the history, maybe give us a lay of the land. Who's who? What is an Afrikaner, and where did they come from?
Right. So, I mean, that's a fascinating question. It comes down to actually a fascinating question of our time in regards to who are we? I mean, it was Samuel Huntington who said at the end of the Cold War that 20th century or the post-Cold War era is going to be defined by the question, who are we? And I mean, when it comes to the Afrikaners, we've not been immune to that question. Who are the Afrikaners? Well, in short, the Afrikaners are the descendants of the predominantly Dutch, French and German settlers that came to South Africa. It is a culture that was formed here. My one colleague, Dirk Herman, always says Afrikaners didn't come to Southern Africa as Afrikaners. We became Afrikaners here, seeing as our language and our culture was formed here. Our language is called Afrikaans. It is one of the world's youngest languages. It has been spoken for a long time, but it was only officially recognized as one of South Africa's official languages, and not a dialect of Dutch, a language on its own, with its own grammatical rules, its own dictionary and everything, in 1925. So this year we are celebrating the 100-year anniversary of that recognition. And so I think that's a piece of nuance that's very important to understand when looking into South African politics, is the fact that it's not a story of black and white. It's not a story of one white group and one black group. It is actually a story of many different groups finding each other in the same place. I mean, when you look at the white population in South Africa, it's not just all Afrikaners. You have Afrikaners, you have English-speaking white South Africans or those of Anglo descent. You have Portuguese white South Africans, Greeks, a complete diverse list of different white South African cultures in the cities. And then you also have the black cultures in South Africa that are just as diverse. Here you have the Vendas, the Chongas, the Xhosas, the Zulus, the Sotho's. You have I mean, South Africa has 11 official languages, and language and culture in South Africa go like this. So, I mean, that should give you a little bit of a picture about how complex it is here. And then we haven't even started on the differences in religion, differences in culture, language, worldview. There's a reason why in political science they always say South Africa is not for beginners, and it's a challenge to fit all this into one quick summary. But I think that lays the groundwork well enough.
So, like, obviously, there's a crisis. There's a series of political tensions in South Africa, and maybe these have gone back decades. But where would you place the origins of this? Or another way of asking this is, how would you characterize your own enemies? Where did they come from? What do they want? Who's funding them? Maybe talk a little bit about that. Like, you guys, you feel like you're under threat. You are under threat. You're under a serious political, economic, and geographical threat. Could you give us a little bit of the background about where those tensions started and who are the people groups or powers maybe that are opposing you?
Right. Again, fascinating, complex question, but with a complex and fascinating answer. So, I mean, the story of South Africa, the entity, only starts in 1910. Before 1910, South Africa doesn't exist. There's a reason why South Africa has a name that sounds a lot more like a region than of a country. It fits in perfectly with regions like Southeast Asia, North America, East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, because it in many ways and characteristics operates a lot more and looks more like a region than like a country. I mean, South Africa is almost the size of the European continent, minus, I think, Spain and one other country. I think if you just Google, your audience can Google South Africa map overlay on over Europe, or even the United States, and you'll see, I mean, the United States is also massive. So I think the American mind grasps vastness a bit better than the European mind when it comes to South Africa. But I mean, at the end of the day, we have a national park in South Africa that's the size of the Netherlands. So that's the type of scale that you're dealing with here. And then you fill this massive landmass, this region, you fill with all these different cultures and religions and languages and races and ethnicities. And it's a recipe for complexity. It's a recipe for conflict. And the story of South Africa for at least the past couple of 100 years has been a story of how do you manage conflict within that incredibly complex situation? How do you, and it's a story of conflict between interests within that complex combination. So I think when it comes to particularly what do our enemies look like, and I mean, this is, whenever I go on some liberal radio station or TV station, if I talk about enemies, they'll zero in on that. And why are you talking about enemies? I mean, there's genuinely people out there that want to destroy the things that I love, and that those people I consider an enemy. So just to put that out there. Who are these enemies? Well, there's many different reasons or many different drives that drive them, but their goal is the same. They might disagree on means, but they do agree on ends. So I'm going to go into the ends because I think the reasons why are there's manyfold of them. The ends that they want to achieve is their answer to the problem of conflict in South Africa from the one side. And that is, I mean, if you look at South Africa and you see all this cultural, linguistic, religious complexity, how do you solve that? Well, one school of thought says you just destroy all of that diversity and complexity and you standardize everyone. I mean, it's standard imperial logic. I mean, if you're building a massive state apparatus, those subjects that you're going to be ruling over, you want them to be as standardized as possible, or as my friend Russell Lamberti says, as legible as possible for the machine. And then you don't want cultural diversity. Then you don't want ethnic diversity. Then you don't want religious or linguistic differences, because that creates a lot of complexities and problems for the machine's effective operation. So South Africa has been a story from the one side of different approaches to solving that problem. I mean, we've seen this, the British tried it, the Afrikaner nationalists tried it, and now the ANC is trying it. And all three of those forces failed. ANC is currently in the process of failing, seeing as they are still in power. But when it comes to particularly the drives, I'm just describing one of the drives. One of the drives is this drive to solve. It's almost the same ideal philosophy that you find behind many globalist ideas of the problem in the world. The problem of conflict is caused by the differences between these groups. I mean, you've all heard the simplistic narrative. And then the childish or almost like simplistic answer to that is, well, if we remove all the differences, we standardize everyone, then we can remove that and the anomaly of conflict, and then it helps the machine operate a bit more smoothly. But as I say, the other drives are a bit less philosophical. I mean, in 21st century South Africa, one of the biggest drives behind the ANC is just pure greed and power and centralizing power in the hands of the state. There is no philosophical drive really there to solve conflict or create a harmonious society. So in the end, I mean, those I think would be the two main driving forces. The one is this philosophical approach of standardizing everyone to solve conflict for cynical reasons, often for the operation of this one of my colleagues always says it, South Africa doesn't look like an empire, but it is kind of operating like a ragtag broken down machine of an empire, because it's trying to unite all these different forces under one artificial banner. But when it comes to particularly the types of attacks that we're seeing, those attacks are always centered around destroying, for example, particularly my language of Afrikaans is one of the favorite targets of the government today. The Afrikaner culture is one of the other targets as well. But at the end of the day, I think there's an important distinction here, in that it is not even just because the Afrikaners are one of the main targets doesn't mean that we are the exclusive target. South Africa is being ruled by deracinated people with no cultural roots at all, people whose cultural roots have been severed. And the South African government has been, for the past 50 years at least, basically been a cultural shredder. They've not been doing anything to advance any of the indigenous languages, including Afrikaans, in South Africa. And they haven't been doing anything to promote cultural diversity in the true sense either. They've just been plowing forward with the centralization model of just accruing more power within the hands of the state, and not really doing anything meaningful for the cultural the preservation of the different cultures in the country. Actually, they've been doing quite the opposite.
Yeah, I'm going to squeeze one more question in, and then I'll let my co-host Andrew. He gets to speak from time to time. But let me just ask you this one more question. Can you relate to us the regime in South Africa? Is that like a siloed regime, or does it have any relation or dependency on like United States of America or any of the other like Western democracies? Like, is it completely siloed, or is it sort of a proxy of what the United States sees as its own imperial vision?
So when it comes to the South African government or the South African regime, it's pretty schizophrenic. On the one side, it has strong aspirations to slot completely into the BRICS sphere, but at the same time, trade-wise, it is absolutely and completely dependent on the Western world. Our largest trading partner may be China, but after that, it's Europe and the United States. And I mean, one of my colleagues mentioned this the other day. He said South Africa does more trade with the small country of Lesotho, that tiny country that sits like the pip of a peach in the middle of South Africa, than we do with Russia, for example. So even though we do have a lot of diplomatic and soft power relations with the BRICS countries, and we position ourselves geopolitically in that direction, South Africa, and by extension the government, is completely dependent to a large extent on the Western world and Western economies, in particular the United States. So even if there are strong aspirations within the government to completely decouple, go into the BRICS sphere, the economic situation just isn't feasible for that at the moment.
Yeah, I guess since I get to ask questions now, what I kind of want to back up a little bit, just because like the average American, even like our listeners, I'm sure have way more knowledge of South Africa than the average American does. But even if you don't, you shouldn't necessarily be ashamed of that.
No, I also just want to put that out there first and foremost. Like I don't blame your listeners or you for not seeing
Yeah.
South Africa as the centerpiece on the world stage. And I often encounter this of Americans being a bit apologetic about their lack of knowledge about South Africa. And I always have to reassure them, we don't expect you to be South Africa experts. We don't even view ourselves as particularly important on the global stage.
Well, yeah, that being said, it is important, right? It is important to know,
I mean, and we can get into that.
Yeah, especially because I think the similarities, and you've already elucidated a few of them, of South Africa and the United States are pretty obvious, right? Especially once I actually ask my question, and so I think, like, just to put it out there, that like most Americans, what we learned at school, if you went to public school like I did, or just from the media, is that South Africa was this backwards place where there's these divisions between white and black, where it was like Jim Crow in America, only way more violent and way more oppressive. Jim Crow on steroids. That's how they were trained to view South Africa. And most Americans don't even know, like, well, how did all these white people get in the southern tip of Africa in the first place? Like, where did they come from? I mean, the assumption is, well, they just colonized it and made all of the African slaves or something. So I mean, just even going back to the very first settlement of the British, of the Dutch, and the various European nations that came to South Africa, what was there when they got there, right? What is something that most people don't even know. So give us, a brief or even a long history lesson about South Africa. Why does it exist there? Where did it come from?
Right. So in regards to that, I mean, again, fascinating question, but at the end of the day, difficult to answer in its entirety. When it comes to particularly the story of South Africa. So I think this is very important to understand. When it comes to South Africa, the best way, I mean, you can't put it on screen now, but I mean, I can give some homework to your listeners. They can go Google, they can pretty much Google the black population demographic map of South Africa, and that tells the whole story. That map tells you exactly the story of South Africa, and you'll see there on that map, on the bottom southern tip, that's where the Dutch landed in 1652 to set up a refreshment station, not to colonize. I mean, a country or a region the size of Europe was not colonized and conquered by 50 Dutch sailors setting up a refreshment station. I mean, if that's a white supremacist theory, if I ever heard one, I mean, super soldiers that landed there.
Wow.
But at the end of the day, that's the story. It started off as just no other interest to any European power, rather other than the Dutch just wanting to set up a halfway point there on their way to the East Indies. Then also, who did they encounter there? Well, they encountered nomadic tribes, the Khoi and the San, who have no relation to the black population in South Africa, seeing as the black population are ethnically of the Bantu tribes, while the Khoi San are a nomadic tribe that are an ethnic group on their own. Their modern descendants are the colored people in South Africa who are not considered black. They are an ethnic group on their own and a culture on their own. But those were the tribes that we encountered, that the Dutch encountered here when they landed in South Africa. And the Bantu cultural groups were trekking down from the north, so they were only encountered much later. So we start off in 1652. The Dutch East India Company lands at the Cape. They start their refreshment station. Jan van Riebeeck, the head of that expedition and that mission, lands here with between 50 and 80 people, and they start this refreshment station. In 1754, 100 years later, a census of the Cape settlement says that about 100 years after the first arrivals, the settler population only stands at about 510. And then 1770, another 120 years after they landed, the first contact was made with the Xhosa people, who are the ancestors of the Black South Africans today. So for the first 120 years, there was no contact between the ancestors of Black South Africans and white South Africans. There was only contact between white South Africa, the ancestors of white South Africans and colored South Africans, and their ancestors were the Khoi and the San, these nomadic peoples. So what you see here is a separation of plus minus 1,000 kilometers between, I think that's, you'll have to do the math for me how many miles that is, but about 1,000 kilometers between the landing point at the Cape and at the Cape of Good Hope and where the first encounter with a black tribe happens. And as I said, if you look at that demographic map of South Africa, you'll see that on the one side, you have this green, dark green coloration. That's where the most Black South Africans live today. And then you have just this emptiness on the right. You can almost draw a line on the map dividing the country in two. Now, why is that? Because firstly, the Bantu migration is happening from the north. So they're moving down from the north. But then there's this cutoff point where there's just nothing. What happens there? Well, that's desert. After that point, you can't really sustain a large settlement of people without borehole technology. So you just have this line there where it stops the Bantu migration pretty much in its tracks. And you'll see there at the tip of this emptiness is where the Dutch settlers landed. They're down at the bottom, at the tip. So the next part of the story is 1795. So this is about 130 years late after the first landing. The British occupy the Cape, ending the Dutch East India Company control over the region. In 1799, about 150 years after the Cape first landing at the Cape, the Dutch East India Company is dissolved. One of my friends always jokes that the Afrikaners must be one of the few peoples in the world that was seeded by a corporate venture. But now this corporation doesn't exist anymore. Now the British take over at the end of the 18th century. And at the end of the 18th century, the Cape settler population stands around 26,000. Then after the annexation of the Cape by the British around 1806, if I remember correctly, a lot of stuff starts happening culturally. So firstly, the Boers, or now the descendants of Dutch, French, and Germans. The French are an interesting story, seeing as the French are the French Huguenots that fled to South Africa, fleeing persecution in Europe, a religious persecution. And that's my first ancestor was Piet Roux, Paul Roux. Paul Roux, a French Huguenot. So I have a French Huguenot ancestry as well. So the Boers start forming. A Boer and Afrikaner are synonyms culturally and ethnically. So the Boers or the Afrikaner culture starts forming here around the early 1800s, a proto-Afrikaner culture. There's not really a point where the culture just emerges. It's always this forming process. But what a critical historical event that coincides now with the annexation by the British Empire is Anglicization. So now, of course, as with any imperial administration, now you have to start speaking English. All the schools are going to start becoming English. The entire legal system that you've been using for decades, that's going to be changed to the British legal system. All the different administrative roles, the roles of power basically within this region are going to go to those loyal to the empire, not to Boers or Afrikaners. So the entire settlement here is turned on its head, which means that Afrikaners are marginalized politically, culturally, linguistically, and ethnically. So this pressure starts building up till you get 1838. In 1838, you have the Boers have reached a point of cultural alienation because that is irreconcilable. They can't fix the situation anymore. They're being treated as inferior second-class citizens under British occupation, and therefore they embark on what we call the Great Trek. The Great Trek is where tens of thousands of Boers trek into the interior of South Africa with limited knowledge of what they will encounter, and the driving force is basically we just want to get away from this this oppression, being treated as second-class citizens. And a lot of people say, oh, well, they were, it was because of the end of slavery, or that's the ending of slavery by the British Empire. That was not the main reason. That was what the narrative that the British Empire told, because then it gives a nice little moral justification on what's going on. These evil Boers, they're just not progressive enough, and now they're fleeing progress. No, they're being treated as second-class citizens in the only home that they have ever known, and now they're trekking into the interior. And one of the facts that disproves this narrative is the fact that a lot of these Boers that trekked were very well off. They left all of their possessions behind. Now, that's not what you do over the ending of slavery. That's what you do as an answer to an existential threat to your community and your culture. So they just start trekking into the interior. We call that the Great Trek, and the Great Trek had such an impact on the zeitgeist of the time that it was actually so. The British Empire was so spellbound by what they were seeing here, it injected the word trek into the English language. So, I mean, without the Great Trek, you would not have Star Trek. You would not be talking about Trek without that historical event happening.
TJ would be sad about
There's
that.
still a lot of history to go, but I mean, we can take a little break there, and you can first.
Well, even like right there. Yeah, Ernst. Even right there, I think it's worth like noting, the similarities between American history and South African history, because at the same time that the Great Trek was happening in America, you have a similar phenomenon, and it isn't because of cultural marginalization and alienation, but rather you have this huge territory that had been purchased by the United States from the French that was more or less empty. That began to be settled, right? And like literally around the same time, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s.
Same type of people as well.
Yeah, where they get into. I mean, every American child our age, if you went to public school, you had the old Apple computers, and you had the floppy disk that you put in, and if you were a good boy at school that day, you got to play a little bit of Oregon Trail and a little computer game where you have a Conestoga wagon and you go shoot buffalo. And so we're wery familiar with that period in American history, and so it's same kind of people doing similar kinds of things, and they're trekking into the unknown.
Pioneers.
And there are native populations there that sometimes are friendly, sometimes are violent. That there's conflict there that took place, and later, within the same time period, you have a civil war in America that also took place, at least in the West, and the South on the frontier. And that kind of roughly maps with the Anglo Boer.
Yeah, wars. I just wanted to say the Great Trek in the next episode, on the next episode of this series, the war starts. Then that's the next fascinating episode.
Yeah, so I mean, you have similar things in the United States that take place, similar types of conflicts as well, and it's this huge landmass that is not settled, at least by Western peoples. You have indigenous populations there that are very tribal and living more or less in the Stone Age, right? But you don't have Western population there whatsoever, and it's totally wide open. They're not able to take advantage of the land, all right, to do agriculture and things like that. And so I think just part of it. Part of the story of South Africa that I think many Americans don't recognize is there's this huge, vast expanse of land that people that the native peoples simply didn't have the technological capability to use that land, whereas the Afrikaners come and they are able to drill wells and make land that otherwise isn't fertile. Right, land that could be used, right, and so there's this open territory that is inaccessible to to native peoples, and it begins to be settled. And so it's not and so in the same way in the United States, right, there are especially after 2020, you would have like these land acknowledgements. Where I was in Minnesota, it was very popular to be like, we are standing on the land of the Mdewakanton Sioux peoples. The
Real
Lakota.
blood and soil vibes, yes.
Yeah, somebody's anyway, right? And
Mm.
and it's just because there's just tremendous guilt that we stole this land from these. Like, well, no, we didn't actually. We negotiated treaties with them that, you know, sometimes the U.S. federal government reneged on and was not was not a good, you know, partner in those things. But overall, like, we give them money, they give us land, right? You have a transaction. No, it wasn't stolen, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that
so,
complexity is just completely ignored in South Africa as well. I mean,
yeah,
there's three ways in which land was acquired in South Africa: conquest, deals, and just empty land that was not owned by anyone.
yeah,
Now, it is a story that the story of South Africa is a story of all three of those playing out, but it's only the conquest that's being focused on. The many deals
yeah.
that went down are just completely ignored. They're not being taught for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and it's the same way in America as well, where it's like, oh yeah, we make this treaty, and both sides kept it, and settlers from Europe, you know, in the Midwest, largely from Germany and Scandinavia, come and they turn barren prairie that nobody had done anything with forever, and they turn it into civilization. And it's like, oh, you're actually supposed to feel bad about that and apologize and feel guilty that this happened. And it's like, well, no, you shouldn't. Why would you? Right? Your ancestors didn't steal anything from anyone. They didn't go around, you know, killing American Indians. They made a farm, right? Like that. What was so
But I
wrong
mean,
about that?
that's why the next chapter in the story is so important, because that's the
Yeah.
story of the Afrikaners getting colonized by Europeans.
This ends the free access portion of the interview. For the full 90-minute discussion, please go to contramundumpod.com/premium and sign up for any of the support tiers. There you can find the links for the full conversation and get access to our Appeal to Heaven show, which features our 20-episode series called Repealing the 20th Century. All this content requires financial resources, and we are grateful for everyone willing to pitch in. See you on the other side.